Hello to you all once again, and another hearty welcome back to your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, where we take a look at more of those old vintage racers from a way back in the day. Now, as we head towards the festive period and of course the winter break from racing, I do hope you will continue to stay tuned to my channel, because we do have some fantastic bikes coming up in the next few months during the winter. So I do hope you will subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so, because that way of course you won't miss out on any future videos that I post. Okay, coming up next, we're going to take a look at a fully authentic factory race bike. Now, this is a quite rare machine, and certainly one of the rarer bikes that I've featured here on my video channel. So without any further delay, let's just jump in and take a look at Keith Ree's 1981 Kramer 410 Factory Racer. Now, over the many years that I've been filming and taking pictures of these old classic dirt bikes, it's probably pretty fair to say that during the last 20 years or so, I've certainly come across quite a few very rare machines from our past, although up until now I've never really had the chance to film a fully authentic works machine, although thankfully I can now cross that particular item off my bucket list, because this featured bike here is a very rare works machine from back in the 1980s. So this lovely looking classic is a 1981 Kramer 410 factory bike, and this example here was ridden to some success during that period by none other than the racing legend himself, Keith Ree. Now, some of you may already remember Keith when he raced a 440 Micro for the Badger Goss racing team in the late 1970s, although it has to be said that Keith wasn't really a big fan of the old Micros, and that's why he then decided to look for a brand new challenge. Now, Keith told me that when he left the Badger Goss's Micro team, he then saw an ad whereby the German Kramer Factory were going to run a rider test day at the famous Matcham's Park racetrack in the UK, where of course Keith then went along and basically fell in love with this Kramer bike, so much so that his lap times on the day of the test led to him being signed up as the brand new Kramer works rider for the new season. Now, Keith also told me that the very first time he threw his leg over one of the new Kramers, he liked it straight away, because it was quite a tall machine, which suited him perfectly because he was also tall in his stature. And the bike was also very narrow, because the bike's rear twin-shock suspension units were tucked up neatly underneath the seat, which gave the bike a much narrower profile than a conventional twin-shocker, whose of course suspension stick out from the frame. Although the best part of this bike, Keith said, was that 410 two-stroke Rotax engine, which just seemed to pull and have limitless amounts of power. Now, in Keith's first ever competitive race event on the new bike, he put himself and the bike onto the runner-up step of the podium at the famous Hoxton Park racetrack. And of course, in subsequent race events, he made quite a name for himself as the new kid on the block, riding what was at that time a relatively unknown motorcycle. Although if we take a closer look at the bike, you'll see that it has a steel chassis, which was very strong and surprisingly light for a bigger bore motocrosser. But of course, at first glance, when you look at this bike for the very first time, the rear does make it look like a more modern monoshock race machine, and I've actually seen instances in the past where club officials have refused to allow these Kramers to run with the twin shock bikes, because they think it's some kind of modern day concoction that somebody's built in their garage, but of course on closer inspection you can see that there's a pair of conventional rear shocks tucked up underneath the bike seat, which of course connect to that rear steel swing arm. And in fact, viewed from behind here, you can't even see the shocks behind this deflector panel, although in 1981 production Kramers, these would have had corticoso or white power shocks as standard, although of course this works bike of Keith's has a pair of good quality Öhlins fitted. Now, as you know, these Kramers were fitted with these Rotax piston port two-stroke motors, and although this is still a factory bike, this is basically a pretty stock 410 power plant that has magnesium engine casings, but in reality no tuning or upgrades were really required on these Rotax engines, because they were pretty quick, just straight out of the box. And as Keith said, these engines had more than enough power even for a factory rider. And besides, when you start upgrading and tuning the motor for more power, it can often lead to it being less reliable. So if it had enough horses in stock trim, then it was probably best just to leave things alone. Now, once more, a big Bing 54 carburetor was used to feed the engine with its fuel, and I suppose it would have been quite easy enough to fit a better quality Japanese Mikuni or similar carb to this Kramer, but I always say that you just can't beat a good old-fashioned Bing for making power, just as long as you have it set up and jetted correctly. And as you can see, when Kramer received these motors from Rotax, they then rebranded them as Kramers, although this was just more or less a sales gimmick, because everybody knew at that time that these were still Austrian-made Rotax power plants. And again, the Kramer's exhaust expansion chamber certainly looks very similar to the old Myco pipes of that 80s period, but these are still genuine Kramer's own design and manufacture, even although they do have some similarities to the old Myco. And of course, Kramer were also associated with Myco way back in the day when they used to build frame kits for the German-based company. And as I remember, I think they were called at the time Kramer Mycos. But as you can see here again, even the bike's tailpipe is eerily similar to the Myco tailpipes of the 1980s. Now, at the front end of the bike, the Kramer is fitted with a set of Italian-made Marzocchi top and bottom triple clamps, or yokes, if that's the way you like to call them. But the front forks are, of course, Myco units, which, as you'd expect, is not really surprising, because Kramer still did have an association with Myco during 1981, so that's more than likely the reason that they used these Myco suspension systems on the front of these bikes. But for 1981, the Myco forks were still pretty good, but Kramer never used the Myco hubs that went with them. They opted to go for these Kramer brake hubs on the front and the rear. Although again, for the early 1980s, many manufacturers, including Kramer, were still using these old school drum brakes as a braking system to try and slow down their race bikes. And because this was still a relatively lightish motorcycle, these Kramer braking systems worked very well, considering that this was still a bike that would more than likely have been raced in the big 500 open class. But moving on to the bike's plastics, and these plastic fuel tanks and all the other plastic parts fitted on these Kramers were all supplied by a local factory that was quite close to the Kramer headquarters in Germany, although by about the time that this bike was made, Kramer were of course struggling a bit financially, and to top it all, the manufacturer who was supplying all of the plastics for these Kramers suffered a very serious fire, and the entire factory was burned to the ground, whereby all of the Kramer's plastics and their moulds were also destroyed in the fire, which they say only helped compound the precarious state that Kramer were in at that time, which of course eventually led to the Kramer Factory closing down soon after. But this reference on the bike's side panel with the Keith Ree stamped on it is naturally in reference to its rider Keith Ree, and Keith more or less used this shortened abbreviation during his entire career with the Kramer Factory, and in fact this Keith Ree identification is also stamped next to the bike's frame number, so that there would be no mistaking this bike's identity and the person who rode it. Although there are just a couple of parts that are not original on Keith's Kramer, and that's these front and rear mudguards that are supplied by Preston Petty, and that's of course since this bike's been restored, you can no longer find original plastics for these Kramers because of the aforementioned fire, although these Preston Petty equivalents are every bit as good as the original factory fittings. Now, the Kramer's seat once again was reasonably comfortable for an early 1980s dirt bike, although racing on some of those rough and bumpy European racetracks back then, Keith would more than likely have spent much of his time just standing on the pegs, just to alleviate the pounding that his poor back would have suffered over the bumpy racetracks. Although back in 1981, when this bike of Keith's was winning races on more or less a regular basis, the Trials and Motocross News publication in the UK did a full 4-page review of this bike in their November issue of that year, and the bike test and subsequent final analysis led to it receiving some excellent feedback from the motocross press. Although since 1981, Keith's Works Kramer of course has undergone more or less a full restoration, and the refurbishment was done by legendary bike restorer Robbie Saville, who has a really good reputation for the quality of his bike builds. And one of the other interesting facts about this particular motorcycle was that this was the very last twin-shock motocrosser to ever come out of the Kramer factory, and this featured bike was built originally by none other than Fritz Kramer himself. Although Keith did tell me that he still looks back on his time with the German Kramer manufacturer as one of the highlights of his racing career, and not only was this 410 bike a fantastic race machine, he said that the people he worked alongside as part of the Kramer racing team were some of the best in the business. And it's just that Kramer, and of course many of the smaller European manufacturers of that time, just couldn't compete with the volume or price of the mighty Japanese manufacturers. But who knows, maybe with the right investment and different circumstances surrounding the Kramer factory and maybe a bit more development, Kramer could quite easily have gone on to be an even bigger powerhouse than it was in the 1980s. And although their rise to fame only really lasted just a few years, these twin-shock motocross racers were without doubt equal, if not better, than anything the big four Japanese manufacturers had back in 1981. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around Keith Ree's quite nice looking 1981 410 Kramer factory machine. It's certainly a very rare bike, and it's something that you don't see at vintage or twin shock race events in this modern day. Okay, coming up in my next video posting, we're going to give you another little treat. Now, this next bike is neither vintage or classic, but nonetheless, it's still a very rare machine. So we're going to take a look at this 2001 Italian-made Vertimati 501. Now, this lovely bike has some excellent engineering surrounding it, so we're going to take a walk around this lovely Vertimati in my next video posting here on my channel. But until then, of course, everybody continue to watch what you're doing out there. If you're riding those old vintage and classic dirt bikes during the winter period, come back safe and well, because we want to see you here again quite soon when we get together to talk about more vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.